Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Academy of Therapy Wisdom, welcome to our live webinar today with Edy Nathan. Today's session is on how grief hides within trauma. My name is Brian Spielman, and I'm the founder of the Academy of Therapy Wisdom, and will be your host today. At Therapy Wisdom, our goal is to provide a premier learning platform where world experts come together to share the wisdom and service of empowering mental health professionals to integrate psychotherapy, spirituality, and social change into their practice that results in a better world. And considering the state of the world today, the pandemic, climate change, and basic laws of impermanence, we can't escape not talking about grief, which brings us to our call today with Edy Nathan. We have over 5,000 folks registered for today. And so thank you for joining us, those who are live and those who will be listening later. As you'll discover shortly, Edy's unique brilliance is working with the dance of grief. This is from her personal experience, life study, and that from her clinical practice. Today's format is that Edy will give a 30 to 40-minute presentation. She's got an incredible number of slides to go through, and then give a brief description about her upcoming course, Unmasking the Pain of Loss, helping clients identify and work with grief. And there'll be time for questions. You're in good technical hands today with our webinar manager, Asa Henderson. And just a Zoom reminder, if you have questions for Edy during the call, you can click the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type your question there. And if you're on a mobile device, just tap your screen. In this short time together, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And before the call, I asked Edy if she'd stay on longer. So we'll close at top of the hour. And then if there's still questions, we'll accommodate and we'll stay on a little bit longer. But I will announce the top of the hour because I know some of you have commitments. So it's my great honor today to introduce Edy Nathan. She's a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in New York City. Edy has a master's degree in psychology, drama, and social work, and postgraduate work in sex therapy, sex education. She's a certified sex therapist, certified hypnotist, EMDR clinician, psychodrama therapist, and Psychology Today blogger. He's also the author, thought I had the book next to me. It's Grief, the Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. And her work in grief, trauma, and sexuality offers insight into the way loss affects the soul and the mind. She uses these insights to breathe new meaning into lives of those stagnant by loss of trauma. So warm welcome to you, Edy. It's so nice to have you here.
It's great to be here.
All yours.
Okay. We have people from all over the world, and I welcome you. I welcome you to a very quick 40-minute journey that we're going to take, and there's going to be lots of information. My slides will be available to you at the end of this adventure that we're on, and so let's just get started. How grief hides within trauma. That's really what we're talking about here today. And grief and how we define grief and how we define trauma is personal. And yet there are some definitions that we definitely love to have as working definitions. So what we're going to do today is talk about those working definitions, but also go through 4 very specific topics. This is the sandhill crane, and the sandhill crane is actually what started some of the story between grief and trauma for me, not in terms of just the life experience, but just how it is part of our nature. It is in nature. And the story around the sandhill crane and my relationship with the sandhill crane is a short one. I was going for a walk. I saw this gorgeous crane, and for whatever reason, we ended up like getting closer and closer to one another, and it was hopping toward me and I was moving toward it. And then I realized what I hadn't realized before, which is that it was missing one leg. And in the missing of that one leg, I could see that it was still beautiful, that it was surviving in the wild, that it had resilience, that it was kind of fearless. Here I am, this human, and I'm with this wild bird. And that within that, it actually held its own superpowers, which are in survival. And that's what grief and trauma kind of need. And in terms of the healing paradigm for it, the dance with it. And this bird, just in its brilliance, in its standing there with its one leg and full and alive and just well fed. And yet it was missing something. And it was missing something that would have made it really feel or experience a default within the wild. And yet somehow it rose above it. And grief and trauma are really the same things. They're like a missing piece of us and with clients that they're missing. For the bird, I was able to see that. With clients, sometimes it's not so obvious. So today we're just going to briefly go over these 4 different lenses, being able to differentiate between trauma and grief, just so you as a clinician can begin to treat them with a different lens. It doesn't mean that the lens you're using isn't working, but it's always nice to have an add-on to assess for grief, when trauma is present, because we're talking so much about trauma. We're talking about it where we're involved with it. We're learning about the body and how the body holds the trauma. We're learning about the brain and the delicious neuroplasticity of the brain and how the brain can be a delicious ally for our clients in terms of their own walking through, moving through, and dancing with their trauma. But the grief is often kind of an undercurrent of something that's not specifically spoken about. Often because I don't know about you, but I know in my training as a clinician, grief was kind of on the side. Trauma was alive and well, but the grief piece was more silent. And then, the 5 stages of grief, and just going through that a little bit more, helping you to understand, okay, well, how does this really lie in the conversation of grief and what I call the phases of grief, and then distinguishing between and talking about what I call the big G's and the big T's, big grief and big traumas. Let's just move on now to the next piece. This is a lens I'd like to offer you around the subtleties of grief that can be especially hard to recognize in the wake of trauma. And what I'm doing throughout today, and actually in the course offering, the 5 modules and the 5 live personable courses that will happen 5 weeks in a row, is really talking about looking at those subtleties from a completely different lens. Grief can hide in plain sight. It can sometimes even look like trauma. So these are my working definitions, okay? What I would like to offer you is the idea that you come up with your own working definition. We have definitions that are given to us. But what do you see? What do you see in your practices? What do you see personally? What do you see when you're working with someone? Because, grief is like your fingerprint. There's no one experiences it the same way. Trauma is the same way. The traumas that one experiences may be a same trauma incident, but it doesn't mean that the experience of it is the same, because everyone experiences it, everyone swallows it, everyone lives with it, everyone allows it to percolate and dances with it. That's having a relationship with it in their own way. So as you can see on the screen, these are my definitions. What they share, though, is survival. They share how the brain compensates for both. And when the brain is alive in this conversation, what's really, really cool is that whether it's grief or whether it's trauma, what's happening in the brain is very, very similar. It's not necessarily the same exact experience of how the brain is working it through and how the amygdala and how the hypothalamus is functioning. It's definitely very much similar in the way the brain holds it. So trauma is, that emotional or physical response, and you can read through that. And then grief and emotional and physical response as well. But then you can see the differences. My goal here is not to read these slides. They're for you, but I just want you to start to see that there's definitely a way that they can be distinguished, and yet they are also very, very much intertwined. For either one, with trauma and grief, what they share is to survive at any cost, to survive at any cost. The grief response, how am I going to survive this at any cost? The trauma response, how am I going to survive this at any cost? And I call the survival piece of this and the people who are in survival mode as survivalists. So grief and trauma is, this is my differentiation slide, because grief will stand alone and trauma will stand alone, and yet they do have a part where they're fused, where they're merged, where the lines are very, very blurry. Someone will come in, a client will come in with a trauma response, an incident that occurred that is of a sexual nature, that is of a domestic violence nature, that is any way that you might describe a traumatic experience or event, because it's going to be different for everyone. And how one defines, again, trauma is going to be different. And how one experiences trauma or even remembers a traumatic event or experience will be different. Grief, you stand on your own. It's a lone journey, just like trauma, except that oftentimes around the grief, people, unlike trauma, where there's a shame component with the grief, there's often not a shame, but there is maybe a hiding or a, I can't deal with these emotions. And so there's the denial, and the denial is part of that grief, those phases of grief. How are you going to treat them more effectively? And that's the question. We talked about the brain just a little bit, just a few minutes ago. And the brain is going to be your ally as a clinician. I didn't come into this work ever thinking, oh, I'm going to be talking about the brain and I'm going to be talking about cognitions. But, here we are. And thankfully, because of science, we know so much and we're forever learning. The brain is that maze. It's like a labyrinth. And there are parts of that labyrinth that we move through. And the maze of the brain, we stop, we start, we try again, and those new pathways get formed. And it's very exciting to see you, as a clinician, have the power to help that client's neural pathways, the neuroplasticity, get created within the brain. You are part of altering those neural connections in partnership with the client. And this is exciting with the work of trauma and where grief hides and how to bring grief in, because grief forms those neural connections. So does trauma. Okay, so there are 3 trauma types. Okay, we can talk about the acute, which is a single incident. We can talk about the chronic, which is also, it's a repeated experience that happens. And then there's the complex, right? Multiple times. The same thing can happen with grief, even though this is really the specific types of trauma. There can be an acute single incident with grief. It can be chronic. We saw the chronic within the pandemic. We see the chronic when there's been a mass shooting and it's affected an entire community. That is trauma and that is grief. And then, of course, we see the ongoing just effects of trauma and grief. And that is that last piece. The amygdala, what does the amygdala do? Well, the amygdala, just a quick line to the amygdala, is it's the overseer of our emotions. It's about survival instincts, the very things that we're talking about here. And it's also about memory. I can see that I didn't get a chance to finish this slide, but what we're talking about here are all of the different avenues around the brain. And when you get these slides, I promise you that the rest of this slide will be finished. However, I want you to know that the hippocampus does a lot of things. I'm sorry, I get a little bit of a speech impediment about that. I need to work on that. But that is also very much part of our brains. It's very much part of survival. It's very much part of grief, that area of the brain. And you as clinicians are really working these two aspects of the brain to help curate all of the varied emotions that are experienced by the client that they may not be able to verbalize. We are often met when there's trauma and then there's that hidden grief, we're met with silence. How do I describe this? How do I bring this into the world when I feel, as your client speaking now, shattered by this? I cannot speak to the trauma, and I have no words for the losses of my grief. Part of your position with the client is, of course, witness and teacher and all of the things that make you the clinician you are. And having some of this brain science, which I'm sure you've all been hearing about and learning and reading about, is part of an ally in your toolkit. What I love about this map is this is something that you utilize with clients, and it is a grief trauma mind map. And it's for you to copy, it's for you to show to your clients, to actually engage with them in session, to give to them as homework. They can download it, you can send it to them, whatever you need to do. When they are able to begin a conversation with their grief and trauma, a whole world opens up for them. But guess what? It also opens up for you. It enables you to be able to zero in on what's working for them, what's not working for them, with an ease of conversation. So where are you feeling it? That's where in the body, where in the mind, where in the heart. You know, what have they been doing about it? You're looking for their strategies. You're looking for the best in them. Like, okay, well, they call a friend. Cool, that's great. Or they're hypervigilant. They're always looking around the next corner. They're not knowing what to do next. They're scared. They're overwhelmed. So they take a pill. They sleep. They go into a deep depressive malaise. They don't go to work. They're not dressing themselves. These are trauma responses. They're also grief responses. Now, this is the managing of it. Well, we know breath, breathing it. You may not be into, breath, but even starting a session with a deep breath, some grounding work, you're not just talking to the client. You're talking to their brains. You're talking to their hearts. You're talking to their feet. You're talking to all the different aspects of who they are in the room. As they present with trauma, they're also presenting with their grief, or they're presenting with grief, and it's a very good chance that there's trauma mixed in there too. And as clinicians, sometimes it's like, well, what do I do next? And we are overwhelmed now more than ever, with the grief responses because of the pandemic and traumatic responses because of the pandemic. So exercise, we know that exercise is sometimes better than any pill anyone could ever take. Write it. Co-write in a session, have them write what they cannot speak and have them read it within a session. And then, of course, talk it out. Give them a sense. This is certainly a CBT exercise of, let's number it. Where are you on the scale? Is your grief at a 10? Is your trauma reaction at a 10? Or are you at a 5? And what makes it a 5? And help them define what a 5 is, and help yourself define what that 5 is. And it's going to be different for everyone who walks into that office, but at least you've got a parameter and you've got the skills that equip you to be the best you can be with quite the adversaries. The two things that people often don't want to talk about: grief and trauma. So this is the second piece. We're going to assess for grief when trauma is present, so you can help your client be specific about their internal emotional experience. And again, it's very much like the maze. Now, we covered a little bit about this in the last slide, but let's move on. So the trauma is when we talk about assessing, we're talking about language gathering, because the language around grief and trauma need to be precise. And oftentimes we can say we're sad, we're mad, we're hurt, we're hypervigilant, we're scared. I feel like I don't want to be a survivor. I don't know who I am in my body. And those are, that's languaging. Helping the client become more specific around that languaging, around common triggers like smells, sounds, places. Like there might be a certain place that is just an overwhelming reminder. I call them pop-up memories. They're pop-up memories. They pop up at the worst times and they just take over and they just grip the client in ways that they cannot describe. They're frozen in it. So the trauma response is, this is what was done to me. The grief is, this is what I've lost because of what was done to me. Your memory, the memory of the client it's what I call the Swiss cheese effect. Now, okay, there is a scientific term. I didn't know this before I came up with this Swiss cheese effect, and it is called the Swiss cheese effect. I know nothing about the scientific term of this, but if it's something that you know, great. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about all those holes in the cheese, and those are memory scoopers. That's where the vortex exists, and you just float down deep into that vortex. The client does, and that's where lost memory exists. And so they've got the whole of the cheese, and then they've got like these holes, and the holes are terrifying. Grief can exist not only within the hole, which is where the lost memory is, but on the exterior of the hole, and can actually make up the rest of the cheese, so to speak, the rest of the embodiment of what's been lost. Because when they know they can't remember 1, 2, 3 years of age, when they know they can't remember something that happened during the pandemic, it's there, but they can't access it. They might feel it in their bodies for sure, but they can't describe it. The loss of being able to access is grief. It's grief. All right, so we're going to do another exercise here. Again, this is for your clients. It's your needs, grief, and trauma. Of course, I would offer that you work these exercises so you become familiar with them. And, the can't think clearly, the memory blocks, the not sleeping, the not eating, the cognitive issues. You know what all of these are. You know them. And then where are they? So if, let's say, the grief is the yellow, is the gold, and they're the fill-in, and the trauma are the empty circles, so where are they? Where are they on this circle? And, can't think clearly. Is this part of their grief, or is it part of their trauma, or is it both? I want to think with clarity. So that's what the need is. So they can then begin to associate, okay, I need to think more clearly, or I need to have what I call cognitive interrupters. Let's break the way they're thinking about the trauma. Let's break the shame. Let's break the shame cycle. And let's then look at the grief, because when there's shame, there's grief. Because when there's anger, there's grief. When there's anxiety, there's grief. Because it's a loss of time, or it's a loss of self, or it's a loss of who you knew you used to be. So let's talk about the 5 stages of grief as a tool for the dying, okay? And I'm sure that all of you know and have heard of and have read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I just have the utmost respect for her. I had a wonderful opportunity to actually work with her as a client when I was going through losses myself, losses that just felt too hard for me to deal with. And yes, her five stages were for the dying. They were sacrosanct. They were this is what the dying go through. And she scientifically studied with heart in hand so many people and families who were witnesses to their loved ones leaving their bodies. And these were the stages, the no, the anger. I'm so pissed. The bargaining, well, what if I do this, and what if I do that? And then the depression of, I guess this is really going to happen. And the malaise, and then the acceptance. I, as a person who works so much with grief and wrote a book on grief, to be honest with you, I have had a very hard time in my own development as a human around the losses in my life to get to a place. If these 5 stages were indeed about people who were family members going through their grief of acceptance, and because acceptance somehow meant, oh, I'm going to accept the fact that I lost my loved one, and I will never accept those losses. I have learned how to dance with them, to partner with them, and to say, no, it's not okay. So I say, scrap the stages. Here come the phases. I see 11 of them. And what you will find in the course as a bonus is I will go through all 11 phases of grief, because 5 is not enough and 6 is not enough. And we need to get to that last phase of grief, but it's nonlinear. It doesn't follow any kind of course. And unlike those 5 stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross set out, it's not linear. It's haywire, it's chaotic, it's incredibly messy. And what these phases do is they help you and your client understand just how messy the phases are. And we want to make it neat. We want to make it all nice and neat. We want to say, okay, you're going to do this, and then you're going to go here, and then you're going to go there, and then you're going to do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. It just doesn't happen that way. And the brain doesn't work that way, not on any level, not for anyone. And thankfully, we're so alive in the patterns of grief, and we're alive in the patterns of trauma. And I'm more concerned with someone who is deadened in their emotionality than is more expressive or a little bit hypervigilant, because it means they're expressing, they're concerned, they're thinking a lot of haywire, a different template of, yeah, it's messy in there, and that's okay, because I, as the clinician, I'm going to sit with your mess, and we're going to sort it out, and we're going to work the labyrinth that's in your brain. And sometimes there's a maze, and sometimes there's a meander. We're going to identify how the big G's and the big T's are held in the body. Now, I talk in my book about the big G's, the big griefs, and the little griefs, the big G's and the little G's. I don't so much talk about the big T's. However, it's a big conversation to be having, because those big T's and those big G's dance together. And you've heard me talk about the idea of the dance, and it sounds counterintuitive, and I understand that it does sound counterintuitive. What? I'm going to dance with grief? I'm going to dance with this? It's a partnership. And what we want our clients to do is form that partnership. We want them to see that grief doesn't just disappear. Trauma doesn't just disappear. They've made imprints on us. They've hit our hearts. They've hit us physically. They attack our most crucial and essential aspects of the self and the way that we knew life before they came into the picture, before they came onto the scene. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time here because, how we think, our cognitions, how we process, it's all impacts how that dance exists, how it lives over time within the life of the client, affects future relationships, affects intimacy, affects the ability to be a good parent, to be a good friend, to take care of the self. I'll never forget one of the most fervent question I got while speaking was a question from a woman who was in her 40s, and she said, everybody tells me that this is just going to go away, this grief that I'm having. Will it? And I said, I'm going to answer you honestly. it's going to lessen, but it doesn't just go away. And it made me think of my own losses. It's not that I want to forget. I just don't want to be impacted by the grief to the point where it takes me down. So it's not about forgetting. It's about learning how to remember with greater peace and grace. And that is also what I'll be talking about as it interplays with trauma in this course. So the big G's, there's a list, right? There's death of a loved one, job loss, illness, sometimes loss of a limb, illness, a diagnosis, long-term illness, okay? The big T's, abuse, sexual, physical, emotional, domestic violence, neglect. And then we've got the cognitions for both. I will be triggered by. No one can touch me. Believe it or not, that's a big T, of course, but it's also a big G. Don't get near me. Don't get close to me. Or, sadly, there are people who lose a loved one, lose a spouse, lose a partner. And as they lose the partner, they end up losing their friendship circle. It's hard to imagine, but sadly, the people in that circle become afraid or don't know how to handle well that lone person. And so there are people who leave that circle. And in the course, I talk about that circle. I talk about the loss and who you need to say goodbye to when you're in the grief response as a client, what they need to do, and who they let go of and who they invite in. The regrets, big G, big T, self-blame. Wish I could have done this differently. It's my fault. It's my fault. And then self-loathing. And so I want to hopefully open up this conversation about this and understand that we're all in this together. I'm a teacher, you're all teachers as well. And that there are many different views and perspectives on grief and death and trauma, and you're all invited in to share those perspectives in our Q&A. So I have two quotes that I particularly love, and one is on trauma. There's no timestamp on trauma. There isn't a formula that you can insert yourself into to get from horror to healed. Be patient. Take up space. Let your journey be the balm. That's Dawn Sarah. And then all the art of living lies in a fine mingling of letting go and holding on. That's Havelock Ellis. I've begun this conversation with you. It's been a very brief conversation in a very short period of time. And I know that I kind of flew through many, many pieces of this. And there's lots of conversation to be had. And I'm looking forward to talking about a little bit more about the course and a little bit more about what the next steps are going to be as we move forward.
Hey, Edy, this is Brian.
Hi.
I know you're just so excited to share your information. And you're someone I trust so much. I've sent your course to many of my family members, actually. I was wondering if you could say a couple words how you got into this work. Because I know you're so passionate, and I got to spend 2.5 days with you, 10 hours a day filming. So if you could share that, it'd be really valuable.
Sure. So when I was a younger person, the love of my life and partner was diagnosed with cancer, and I had a year with him, and I was 27 when he died, and I was going into a whole different field. And what I realized is at 27, there was nobody to help. There was nobody to talk to. There was nobody to understand that at 27, it didn't matter if I had a long life ahead of me, and it didn't matter that that I would maybe find somebody else to love. This was the person who taught me love, and he was gone. And I then decided to make it my life's work. I went back to school. I got a couple of degrees, And I decided to do research on not only grief and loss, but creative ways to help people move through something that felt so silent within me that had little expression. And that's what I do now in my work as a clinician. I utilize role play and psychodrama and creative methods, just like you saw some of the exercises. I'm very much involved in helping myself and my clients and teaching other clinicians how to get the conversation going in a place where the silence that exists within and the trauma of having lost a loved one, the trauma of what the pandemic has been for so many. There's not one person I know in my sphere that didn't lose someone or didn't know someone who lost someone. People who were stuck in their apartments and the apartment was 250 square feet and couldn't go out, and how much that played in with the mind and with the heart and the trauma that emerged, and the grief that had nowhere to go, and the rituals that didn't have a chance to be expressed. And even if grief was not something that you specialized in, it's hiding in anxiety and it's hiding in traumatic experiences. I can't tell you how many clients have reported, I didn't even remember a traumatic experience, and it then came in, and now I'm grieving what I didn't even know I needed to grieve, and the lost relationships and some new relationships and a loss of self that now needs to come up. So what I realized in my journey after having lost my partner was that grief was so much more than just the loss of a loved one. It was the loss also of the self. So that's
Thank
a
you
little
so
bit about
much.
my story, Brian.
Sorry to put you on the spot. That was not planned, everybody.
No, that was totally not planned, but he knows me well enough. He just got me. That's all. So let's just talk about this course. So there are, it's really exciting because, I just want you to know that I so appreciate that you are all on the call and that you've stayed on this call for this time. As clinicians, we're here in this field to help people, right? To change their brains, to help them feel more settled within themselves. And if you incorporate some of the exercises that you learned today and also that are in the course, it's going to make your work easier with clients, and it's going to help not only your clients, it's going to give you a whole slew of tools in a toolbox that really, if you're not a grief expert, you're not going to do that deeper dive. Your expertise is in anxiety, or your expertise is in depression or malaise or even trauma. Oftentimes that grief piece doesn't get noticed. So to go much deeper, to gain that proficiency, will just take you on a wonderful journey for yourself and also for your clients. So the other piece here is, I love teaching this, and redefining grief starts with this idea of having and gaining curiosity and rapport. And I define it, I redefine it. I'm always looking at ways to have a greater conversation around it. And what you'll learn in each of the modules, which are all recorded. So this is module 1, what's up on the screen. And I'm sure you've had a chance as I've been speaking to see this. I'd like you to see the next module now, because I'm really excited about this next module as well. So this next module is this new lens, and I'm using the hero's journey. So that's Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And the hero's journey is such an interesting journey. And really, whenever a client comes in to us, they're going through that. But whether they come in and see a valued clinician and the help of your expertise in life, we are always going through these life cycles from birth until death. And yet we have these birth and deathing cycles throughout. When meeting grief and trauma, there are many, many cycles that we go through that are the hero's journey. And so you'll have this map that you can go to, and it's almost like a light bulb goes off, and it's like I'm taking the client, or the client is going into this innermost cave. Module 3, we're redefining grief. with your client, and we're talking about the different personalities. So one of the things that we don't tend to talk about, and we're not even taught in school, is the importance of the client and who they are. Are they an introvert, an extrovert? Are they an ambivert? Because who they are will help you determine, gee, what are the best moves I can make as a clinician? So that's like that's the next module. And these are all recorded. You will have them forever, 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 forever. Okay, let's go on. So in this next piece, grief is nonlinear, and it's facing and looking at the nonlinear aspects of grief, for sure. Those nonlinear aspects of grief, they come in different ways. And I really go over how they come in, why they come in the way they come in. And it's valuable for you to really understand that this non-linear aspect is actually a good thing, because then there's no, well, if we go through this and we go through that, and then if we look at anxiety, and then we look at anger, and then we look at depression, and we just follow this, then there's freedom. There's true healing that's happened. But the thing is that sometimes when there's depression, the anxiety creeps in, and the client is like, but I thought that I was over this, or I thought that this grief was going to end. And I would much rather just say, it's not. It's going to look differently. You're going to embody it differently. And that's exciting. That's exciting. Fantastic. So this is grief work, process and progress. And that's what we're going to be talking about as well, is we're going to identify the avoidance factors for moving forward, which is a lot of times about forgiving. And that has to do with trauma and with grief. And I've got a model for forgive. And I also use Enright's model of forgiveness, which is just a wonderful model. Again, all of this is for you. It's recorded, and it's forever. Once you sign up for the course, it belongs to you. It's yours. All right. So I've also got some special bonuses, and I'm really excited about these special bonuses. And one of the things that I really loved about joining the Academy of Therapy Wisdom, one of the things that I really loved was the fact that there's so much that we get to give you. There's so much that I get to give you. And, it's these bonuses. It's the fact that, if you're BIPOP, you will get a discount. It's the fact that this is a forever kind of course that is yours forever. So I will be interviewing, Dr. Lisa Ferenc. She's an amazing woman. She's got a lens about using actually psychodrama and using role play and using theater to help people get to the very base of the grief and the trauma that they experience. And then Cindy Darnell, she's a force to be reckoned with. A lot about sex and sexuality, and where there is a component of grief when people are in their own sexual dilemmas, or they're facing aging, or they're anywhere on the LGBTQ plus within that community. And we have a very rich conversation. Natalie, we are going to be talking about just a wonderful perspective on consultations and transformation. She consults on the best way to really transform the self with an embodied dialogue. I'm very excited to share that with you. And then Ruth Cohn, she has spoken about neglect and grief and trauma, and neglect is sometimes it gets neglected within our own spheres. And so, we get to really listen to her wisdom around this. So all of these bonuses. And then I didn't really want to do this, but I have my journal called Notes to Self, where I talk about all of the different ways you can write about your clients, and can write about what is going on for them on a daily basis. Where are they stuck? Who are their superpowers? And what is their metamorphosis? And this can be like a note to you, and it can be a note to themselves, and it can be an ongoing PDF journal that is private to them. It's yours, it belongs to you, and you can also share it. And I've also got my Working with Grief workbook, which again can be shared with your clients. You can use it, and it's exercises. It's a lens. I talk about the 4 seasons of grief. So you can see that you're getting so much around this. You're getting the 5 long live calls, and we've gone and those 5 live calls, I start them next week, next Friday, and those 5 live calls. So each week for 90 minutes, it's me and you. We'll talk. I'll talk for about 45 minutes, an hour, and then it's a Q&A between you and me. And if you have more questions, you can always write them in, and I'll answer them. This is a conversation that we need to be having, and I can't wait to be having it with you. So you can see these 5 live calls. So thank you, everyone, for being here with me today.
Thank you, Edy. And I want to get to Q&A, but usually our model is the 5 live calls match the 5 modules, but Edy had so much information. I don't know if we just didn't tell you that, or you just had so much to share. So you're actually really getting 10 modules. This person is such an encyclopedia of knowledge and wisdom and interactive, and your exercises are so brilliant. Chantel asks, thank you for your presentation. Was wondering what your thoughts are on the worldwide mental health epidemic affecting young people, teens and preteens, and its roots in trauma and grief.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, our young people and the grief and the trauma that they're experiencing was sealed with the pandemic, and the mental health crisis of our young has certainly been affected not only by the pandemic, but sadly, I think prior to the pandemic, the degree to which social media and the way that they have gone into the social media platform and based their sense of self-worth, and also sadly the degree to which there's been bullying and brutality online and affected so many suicides. And then we must look at the people who are raising our young, and just not being equipped to really know how best to navigate all of the social media that was not part of their lives necessarily. And what we know is around grief and around trauma, and actually around just mental health, as we need to find ways to create greater communities. We need to find ways to put the phones down, to be able to, I don't mean this in a funny way, but to get close enough to people where we're actually looking at them and smelling them, and to get back to something that's primal. We're getting away from some primal instinctual pieces that perhaps helped with some of the grief and the traumas of just development that just come by of developmental processes. And then, of course, there's the grief and the trauma that has to do with the incidents of young people not being protected and being physically, mentally, and sexually hurt, and not having enough services for all people, especially in our middle income communities, and the screams and the cries for help, and the depressions of living in war zones. And this is such a big question, and we need to get grief and trauma conversations into our schools. And as clinicians, we might be able to help that as we talk to our children's teachers and principals and get those messages out.
Thank you. And Melinda asks, and back to an early statement I made from chat, does this training take into account Black and Indigenous cultures which experience continuous grief more often due to systemic and structural racism?
So the way that I design the course is it's not specific to race. When I speak to any of the lenses, it is always about all people. And my hope is that if someone comes from an an indigenous culture, that they will be able to take what I have taught and put it into their own languaging with their own paradigm, because this is for you to utilize and make your own. And because I couldn't cover every indigenous culture, that I didn't want to be unfair, and yet the scope is, this is for all people, this is for all genders, this is for all races. And yes, within different cultures, people experience and move through grief in very, very different ways. And that's a sociological, architectural kind of conversation. And though I didn't really do a deeper dive into that, I come into the conversation talking about masks. And mask to me is a very much a primal indigenous piece of work. And I herald the work that comes with using a mask as a way of communicating what is going on, and that the work within the tribal communities. I was just in Africa, and we talked at length about masks and the importance of choosing a mask and what masks represent. And so I talk about literal masks, and I also talk about the masks that we wear.
That's what I'm hearing. And I know you have your own spiritual journey.
I do, very much so.
It has enough structure that it's, what should I say, non-denomination, it's all people.
Yes.
So many good questions. How do you manage this is from Jennifer. How do you manage the emotions of a client who wants to die along with their deceased loved ones? They've given up and no longer want to be on the earth without the loved ones. How do you give them hope to live?
So if they're coming into a session and they're sharing this with you, just the fact that they've walked into your office is hope. With that, I would work on the fact that that person walked in, and I would actually bring alive, and I talk about role play also in the recorded sessions, and I'll talk about it also in the live sessions, the idea of, so let's bring all of these people into our session and let's see what they've taught you, because somehow you've landed here and I want to hear from you. I want to know about these people, and I want you to bring them alive because they've been your teachers as well. And though you may want to join them because you feel that you don't have a reason, is this what they would have wanted for you? Which matters less, and it's not, it can sound like a con, and when delivered well and right, then it's not about, a move that is made by the clinician. Rather, it's how am I going to help you get to your heart? Because it feels like it's so broken and shattered. And how are we going to help you remember that if you want to join them, it means that you loved them. And it's never about forgetting. It's about how are you going to dance with them? And so my mom died 22 years ago, and I knew she was dying, and I had some, good moments with her. But I must tell you that the woman who I met dying was not the woman who was my mother. And the woman I met dying, I wished had been my mother. And that woman I wanted to join. That woman I wish I had been able to join. And so in honor of her, she loved to shop. I will do something that's part of my spiritual journey that integrates part of what she enjoyed into my own life. And it fills some part of my heart that's broken for the woman I didn't have all my life, but got to meet her last 6 months.
Sharon asks, during the webinar series, will you be talking about the importance of grieving loss, which results from developmental and childhood trauma?
I do talk about developmental and childhood trauma. I actually talk about in one of the modules, and I also bring it into the live, the importance of creating a timeline with your client, and the importance of when on this timeline to look for those developmental and childhood traumas, because the grief is lurking there, and that grief has its own languaging that may be very young, which is why today I talked about the importance of language and being precise in language, because if you're hearing young language, chances are whatever happened during that time was the memory of that initial grief was young. So in the live sessions, I will address those pieces based on the topics that come up. So, for example, in the role play or in the different lens, if a child developmentally is more of an introvert, are they an introvert? There's introversion that is just a biologic introversion, but there can also be an introversion that's really evolved as a result of a childhood trauma. Go silent.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for staying on past the hour. And thank you, Edy, for sharing. I know something that's your life's journey, your purpose. This is her book. I got to unblur my screen. Her brilliant book that we go into much more detail in the course.
So can you just hold that up one more time? Because we've still got a bunch of people on the call. And I just want to say, I want to explain the cover to you because it's really exciting. So this cover is obviously a person, but it's any person. And it's the idea that grief, it takes a leap of faith to go on this journey. And it is that leap of faith that I'm asking you to take in this course. Okay. It's a leap of faith to be able to look at what is going on with my client and with myself around my own grief or my client's grief. And it is in tarot, it is considered the fool's card. And the fool must take a leap of faith to know what the journey will be in the future.
That was really beautiful. I'm glad you got that in.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Take care. See you.